Have you ever wondered what drives someone to risk everything for a stranger? Maya Chun was about to discover that sometimes heroism chooses you, even when you have nothing left to give. The rain soaked through her worn jacket as she huddled against the brick wall of Marcello's, the upscale Italian restaurant where the smell of garlic and fresh bread made her empty stomach clench with hunger. 3 days since her last real meal. 2 weeks since she'd been evicted from the studio apartment she could no longer afford after losing her job at the accounting firm. 6 months since the car accident that claimed both her parents and left her drowning in medical debt that bankruptcy couldn't touch. Maya pulled her knees closer to her chest, trying to make herself invisible to the well-dressed patrons walking past. At 24, she'd never imagined her life would come to this. College graduate, former CPA, reduced to sleeping in doorways and hoping for spare change. The shame burned almost as much as the hunger, but pride didn't pay for food or shelter. "Where are you from?" she wondered, watching a couple emerge from the restaurant, their laughter carrying on the evening air. "Do you have family waiting at home? People who love you no matter what happens?" She'd had that once. The memory of her mother's smile and her father's terrible jokes felt like a lifetime ago, before the drunk driver ran the red light and shattered everything she thought she knew about how life worked. The black SUV pulled up too fast, tires squealing against wet asphalt. Maya's head snapped up from her thoughts as 3 men in dark clothing jumped out, their movements sharp and purposeful in a way that made her pulse quicken. Something was wrong. Very wrong. An 80-year-old boy with dark curly hair had been waiting by the restaurant's entrance, probably for his parents to bring the car around. His small face showed confusion as the men approached him, their intent suddenly crystal clear to Maya, even from 15 feet away. They were going to take him. Every rational thought in her head screamed that this wasn't her problem. She had nothing. She was nothing. Getting involved would only bring more trouble into a life already destroyed beyond repair. The smart thing was to look away, mind her own business, survive another day on the streets. But looking at that little boy, seeing the fear creeping into his dark eyes as one of the men reached for him, Maya saw herself at 8 years old. Scared, vulnerable, needing someone, anyone, to care enough to help. She moved without thinking. Maya launched herself from the wall, her malnourished body finding strength she didn't know still existed. The first man had his hands on the boy's shoulders when she collided with him, knocking him sideways. The child stumbled backward toward the restaurant door as chaos erupted around them. "Get inside." She wanted to scream at the boy, but there wasn't time for words. The second gunman was already raising his weapon, his face twisted with rage at the interference. Maya threw her arms around the child, covering his small body with her own as she pushed him toward the restaurant entrance. The first bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around. Pain exploded through her chest as the second bullet found its mark. Still she held on to the boy, her vision blurring as she felt his desperate hands clutching her jacket. The third and fourth shots came almost simultaneously, one tearing through her side, the other shattering her left arm. Maya collapsed onto the wet sidewalk, her body curled protectively around the child even as darkness crept in from the edges of her sight. She could hear screaming now, people shouting, the boy crying. Good. People were coming. He would be safe. Through the growing haze of unconsciousness, she heard new voices. Authoritative. Dangerous. The gunmen were backing away, getting into their vehicle. Someone was giving orders in rapid Italian, the voice deep and commanding in a way that made even dying seem less frightening. Strong hands were touching her face, tilting her head up. Maya fought to focus on the man leaning over her, trying to process what she was seeing through the fog of shock and blood loss. Dark hair, olive skin, eyes the color of storm clouds. Expensive suit despite the rain and chaos. He was speaking to her, his voice urgent, but she couldn't make out the words over the ringing in her ears. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the little boy's face, tear-streaked but alive, peering over the stranger's shoulder. Worth it, she thought as consciousness slipped away. Whatever happened to her now, it had been worth it. Maya woke to the sound of machines beeping softly around her. The ceiling above was pristine white, unmarked by the water stains and peeling paint she'd grown accustomed to in the shelters. The bed beneath her was impossibly comfortable, the sheets crisp and clean in a way that spoke of luxury rather than charity. This wasn't a hospital. At least not any hospital she'd ever seen. Her body felt distant and strange, wrapped in bandages and connected to various tubes and wires. Pain medication created a floating sensation that made thinking difficult, but one thought cut through the haze with startling clarity. She was alive. Against all odds, after taking 4 bullets, she was still breathing. The door opened with barely a whisper of sound. The man who entered moved like someone accustomed to command, his presence filling the room despite his careful quietness. As her vision cleared, Maya recognized him as the stranger who'd been leaning over her on the sidewalk. Up close, she could see he was probably in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested barely leashed power. He approached her bed slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might frighten her. When he spoke, his voice carried a slight Italian accent that made each word sound deliberate and important. "I'm Vincenzo Romano," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "You saved my son's life." Maya tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. "The boy, is he okay?" "Antonio is fine, thanks to you." Vincenzo's storm-gray eyes held an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her weakened state. "The doctors weren't sure you would make it through the first night. You've been unconscious for 6 days." 6 days. Maya's mind struggled to process the information. The medical equipment surrounding her, the private room, the round-the-clock care she must have been receiving. None of this made sense for someone like her, someone with no insurance, no family, no ability to pay. "I can't afford this," she whispered, panic cutting through the medication-induced calm. "Whatever this costs, I can't pay for it." Something shifted in Vincenzo's expression, a softening around his eyes that transformed his intimidating features. "You threw yourself in front of bullets to save my child. You think I care about money?" The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Maya wasn't ready to examine. She'd spent months learning that everything had a price, that kindness came with conditions, that survival meant never owing anyone anything you couldn't repay. This man was offering something that seemed impossible in her experience. Help without strings attached. But looking at him, seeing the controlled power in his posture and the expensive cut of his clothes, Maya suspected that owing Vincenzo Romano a debt might be more dangerous than she could imagine. Men who commanded this kind of wealth and authority didn't operate by the same rules as everyone else. Still, as exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep and the steady beeping of monitors reminded her how close she'd come to dying alone on a sidewalk, Maya found herself grateful beyond words. For the first time in months, she was warm, clean, and safe. Whatever came next, whatever price this kindness might eventually demand, right now she was alive because this stranger had chosen to save her. That had to count for something in a world that had taken everything else away. Maya woke again to find Vincenzo sitting in the same chair, though his clothes had changed and stubble shadowed his jaw. How long had he been keeping vigil beside her bed? The thought both comforted and unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. "Antonio wanted to see you," he said, noticing she was awake. "To thank you himself. But I thought you should recover more first." The mention of his son brought back the memory of small hands clutching her jacket, the weight of a child's body she'd shielded with her own. Maya's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. In all her months of struggle and loss, that moment of protecting someone else had felt like the first meaningful thing she'd done since her world collapsed. "How old is he?" she asked. 8. Vincenzo's voice carried a tenderness that transformed his intimidating presence completely. "His mother died when he was 3. He's been the center of my world ever since." The pain in those simple words resonated with Maya's own grief. She understood the weight of losing someone irreplaceable, the way it changed everything about how you moved through the world. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Vincenzo studied her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how she must look. Pale, weak, probably a mess despite the obvious care she'd been receiving. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. "You didn't know us. You had no reason to get involved." Maya closed her eyes, remembering the moment when every logical thought had screamed at her to stay hidden while her body moved toward danger anyway. "I was 8 when my parents got divorced," she said finally. "My mom worked 2 jobs to keep us in our apartment. One night, she was walking home late from her second shift when 3 men cornered her in the parking lot." She paused, the memory still sharp after all these years. A neighbor heard her screaming and came running. Just some random guy who could have minded his own business and stayed safe inside. Instead, he grabbed a baseball bat and charged three armed men because someone needed help. Did he save her? Vincenzo asked. Maya opened her eyes to find him leaning forward slightly, completely focused on her words. He saved her life. Got stabbed twice for his trouble, but he saved her. She took a shaky breath. When I saw those men reaching for Antonio, I kept thinking about Mr. Rodriguez and how he didn't hesitate when someone needed him. Something had shifted in Vincenzo's expression during her story, a recognition that made her pulse quicken despite her weakness. You could have died. I almost did anyway, Maya said with a bitter laugh. I've been homeless for 2 weeks, living on the streets, sleeping in doorways. Dying while saving someone else's child seemed better than dying alone from exposure or hunger. The words hung between them, more honest than she'd intended to be. Maya had learned to hide her desperation, to maintain what little dignity remained when everything else had been stripped away. But the medication and exhaustion had lowered her usual barriers. Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes studying her face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested her words had affected him more than he was letting on. You're not homeless anymore. Before Maya could process what that meant, the door opened, and a woman in a white coat entered. Dr. Castellano smiled warmly as she approached the bed, though her professional demeanor couldn't quite hide her curiosity about the obviously powerful man who'd been maintaining constant vigil. How are we feeling today, Miss Chun? The doctor asked, checking the monitors and making notes on her chart. Better, Maya answered honestly. The pain was still significant, but the floating sensation from the stronger medications was beginning to clear. Good. You're healing remarkably, well considering the trauma. However, full recovery will take several months. Physical therapy, careful monitoring of the surgical sites, gradual building back to normal activity levels. Maya's heart sank. Months of medical care meant debt she could never hope to repay. It meant depending on charity or government programs that came with their own complicated requirements and limitations. It meant accepting help from this dangerous stranger whose motives she couldn't begin to understand. She'll have the best care available, Vincenzo said with quiet authority. Whatever she needs. After Dr. Castellano left, Maya struggled to find words for the gratitude and terror warring in her chest. I can't let you do this, she finally said. I don't even know who you are, what you do for work. I can't take on debt I'll never be able to repay. Vincenzo stood and moved to the window, his broad shoulders tense beneath his expensive shirt. I own several businesses in the city. Import, export, real estate development. I can afford to help you without creating hardship for myself or my family. Something in his tone suggested there were aspects of his business dealings he wasn't sharing, but Maya was too overwhelmed to press for details. Even if his wealth was legitimate, accepting this level of help felt impossible. She'd learned the hard way that kindness always came with expectations. I have an estate in Westchester, Vincenzo continued, turning back to face her. Guest quarters, full medical facilities, staff who can assist with your recovery. You'd be safe there while you heal. Maya's breath caught. An estate. She'd gone from sleeping in doorways to being offered accommodation that probably cost more per month than she'd made in a year at her accounting job. The magnitude of his generosity was almost harder to process than the shooting itself. I can't, she whispered. I can't accept something that enormous from a stranger. Vincenzo returned to his chair, leaning forward with an intensity that made her pulse race. You saved my son's life. You took bullets meant for him. You think that makes us strangers. The logic was undeniable, but accepting felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea what waited at the bottom. Maya had spent months learning to rely only on herself, to expect nothing from others except disappointment. This level of care and protection seemed too good to be true. Where else will you go? Vincenzo asked gently. When you're released from here, what's your plan? Maya closed her eyes against the truth of his question. She had no plan beyond surviving one day at a time. No family to call, no friends with resources to help, no savings or support system to fall back on. The shelter wait lists were months long, and her injuries would make finding work even harder than before. 3 days later, Maya found herself in the passenger seat of Vincenzo's Mercedes. watching familiar city streets give way to tree-lined roads and increasingly expensive neighborhoods. Her discharge from the medical facility had been seamless, handled with the kind of efficiency that money could buy. The estate took her breath away. Stone and glass architecture that managed to be both imposing and welcoming, set on acres of perfectly maintained grounds. It was the kind of home she'd only seen in magazines, the sort of wealth that seemed abstract until you experienced it firsthand. "This is your home," Vincenzo said as they pulled into the circular driveway. "For as long as you need it to be." Maya stared at the mansion rising before them, trying to reconcile this reality with the doorway she'd been sleeping in just over a week ago. The contrast felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life entirely. As Vincenzo helped her from the car, his hands careful of her still-healing injuries, Maya caught herself noticing the way he moved. Confident without being arrogant, protective without being possessive. When he'd first appeared at her bedside, she'd been too weak and disoriented to fully appreciate the man behind the rescue. Now she was becoming acutely aware of his appeal in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. That evening, after being settled into guest quarters that were larger and more luxurious than any apartment she'd ever lived in, Maya joined Vincenzo for dinner in a dining room that could have seated 20 people. The intimacy of sharing a meal in such a grand space felt both awkward and strangely comforting. "Antonio will be back from his grandmother's house tomorrow," Vincenzo said, passing her a dish of pasta that smelled incredible. "He's been asking about you every day." The thought of seeing the boy she'd saved brought a warmth to Maya's chest that had nothing to do with the excellent wine Vincenzo had poured. In a life that had felt increasingly meaningless, knowing she'd made a difference for one small person mattered more than she could express. "Tell me about yourself," Maya said, surprising herself with the boldness. "Beyond the businesses and the wealth, what matters to you?" Vincenzo was quiet for a moment, his storm-gray eyes reflecting something that might have been loneliness. "Family," he said finally. "Protecting the people I care about. Making sure Antonio grows up feeling safe and loved." There was something in his tone that suggested safety wasn't a given in his world, that protection required constant vigilance and careful planning. Maya found herself wondering what kind of business required such precautions, what sort of threats a man like Vincenzo might face on a regular basis. But looking at him across the elegant table, seeing the way his face softened when he spoke about his son, Maya felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about survival or basic needs. She was thinking about the man who'd saved her life and wondering what it would be like to matter to someone that powerful, that protective. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Antonio Romano was nothing like Maya had expected. The 80-year-old who bounded into the guest quarters the next morning carried himself with a confidence that reminded her immediately of his father. But his smile was pure childhood joy, untouched by whatever shadows existed in Vincenzo's world. "Miss Maya," he said, his dark eyes bright with excitement. "Papa told me you're the lady who saved me from the bad men." Maya's throat tightened as she looked at his animated face, remembering the weight of his small body as she'd shielded him from bullets. "Just Maya is fine," she said softly. "And you don't need to thank me for anything." "But I do," Antonio insisted with the serious determination only children could manage. "You got hurt protecting me. That makes you family now." The simple statement hit Maya harder than she'd expected. Family. She'd been alone for so long that the word felt foreign, like something from a language she'd once known but forgotten how to speak. Antonio seemed to sense her emotion because he moved closer to her chair, his small hand reaching out to gently touch her bandaged arm. "Does it hurt very much?" he asked with genuine concern. "Not so much anymore," Maya answered honestly. "Your father made sure I had the best doctors. Papa takes care of everyone," Antonio said with absolute certainty. "That's what he does." Over the following days, Maya began to understand what the boy meant. Vincenzo had quietly rearranged his entire schedule to work primarily from his home office, ensuring someone was always nearby during her recovery. He appeared for meals with unfailing regularity, checked on her progress with the physical therapist, and somehow managed to anticipate needs she hadn't even recognized herself. The domestic routine they fell into felt surreal given how they'd met. Morning coffee together in the sunroom, while Antonio got ready for his private tutor sessions. Afternoon physical therapy where Vincenzo often assisted, his strong hands supporting her as she relearned to move without pain. Evening dinners that stretched longer each night as conversation flowed more easily between them. Maya found herself looking forward to these moments with an intensity that both comforted and alarmed her. After months of focusing solely on survival, having someone genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions felt like rediscovering a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. She was resting on the terrace one afternoon, watching Antonio practice soccer kicks on the vast lawn, when Vincenzo joined her with 2 cups of tea and a folder he seemed reluctant to discuss. "We need to talk about why those men tried to take Antonio," he said, settling into the chair beside hers. Maya's pulse quickened at the serious tone in his voice. She'd been so focused on recovery and the strange new reality of living in luxury that she'd almost managed to forget the violence that had brought them together. Almost. "The kidnapping wasn't random," Vincenzo continued, his storm gray eyes fixed on his son's distant figure. "It was planned by the Torino family. They've been trying to pressure me into giving up territory in Little Italy." Territory. Maya's stomach clenched as implications began forming in her mind. "What kind of business are you really in, Vincenzo?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Maya could see the internal struggle playing across his features. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that confirmed her growing suspicions. "My family has been involved in certain aspects of business in this city for 3 generations. We provide services and protection that exist outside traditional legal frameworks." The careful words couldn't disguise what he was telling her. Maya felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her. Mafia. She was living in the home of a mafia boss, accepting protection from a man whose business dealings involved violence and crime on a scale she couldn't even imagine. "You're telling me you're a criminal?" she whispered. Vincenzo's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you that I operate in a world where men like the Torinos think they can target children to get what they want. I'm telling you that your heroic act put you in the middle of a conflict that has nothing to do with you, but everything to do with me." Maya stood abruptly, ignoring the pull of healing muscles as she moved away from him. This was insane. She'd saved a child from kidnapping only to discover she'd involved herself with organized crime. The man who'd been so gentle with her injuries, so careful of her comfort, made his living through methods that probably included everything she'd been raised to consider morally wrong. "I need to leave," she said, panic making her voice tight. "I can't be here. I can't be part of this." Vincenzo rose smoothly, his presence commanding even when he wasn't trying to intimidate. "Where will you go, Maya?" "Back to the streets. Back to sleeping in doorways and hoping someone doesn't hurt you while you're vulnerable and alone." The truth of his words hit like a physical blow. She had nowhere else to go, no resources to start over, no family or friends with the means to help her rebuild her life. But staying meant accepting protection from someone whose methods she couldn't condone, becoming complicit in a world she didn't understand. Before she could respond, Marco Santos appeared on the terrace with the quick efficiency that suggested urgency. Maya had met Vincenzo's head of security briefly during her first day at the estate, a compact man in his 40s whose alert eyes missed nothing and whose presence always seemed to carry an underlying tension. "We have a problem," Marco said without preamble. "The Torinos made contact. They know she's here." Maya watched Vincenzo's entire demeanor shift, the careful gentleness he'd shown her replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "What kind of contact?" he asked with deadly quiet. Marco glanced at Maya uncertainly. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." "She's already in this," Vincenzo said firmly. "She has a right to know what she's facing." "Phone call to the main line 20 minutes ago," Marco explained. "They know you're protecting the woman who interfered with their operation. They're suggesting that makes her a legitimate target for retaliation." The words hit Maya like ice water. She'd thought saving Antonio would be the end of her involvement, a single moment of heroism she could carry with her as something meaningful in an otherwise broken life. Instead, it had marked her as an enemy of people who thought nothing of targeting children and innocent bystanders. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "It means they might try to hurt you to send a message to me," Vincenzo answered with brutal honesty. "It means staying here is the safest option you have, regardless of how you feel about my business dealings." Maya sank back into her chair, the weight of her situation settling around her like a trap she couldn't escape. She was caught between streets that offered only slow death through exposure and poverty, and protection from a man whose world included violence she couldn't begin to understand. That evening, after Marco had briefed them on enhanced security protocols and the various measures being taken to ensure the estate remained secure, Maya found herself alone with Vincenzo in his study. The room felt intimate despite its size. Lined with books that suggested depths to his character she was only beginning to discover. "I know what you're thinking," Vincenzo said quietly, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. "Do you?" Maya challenged, settling into the leather chair across from him. "You're wondering how someone who's been so careful with your recovery, so gentle with your injuries, can be involved in things that require this level of security. You're trying to reconcile the man who reads to you in the evenings with someone whose enemies think kidnapping children is acceptable strategy." The accuracy of his assessment made her chest tighten. "That's exactly what I'm thinking." Vincenzo finally looked up, his storm-gray eyes reflecting a complexity that made her pulse race despite everything. "My father built this organization on the principle that we protect our own and we don't involve innocents. When I took over 8 years ago, I maintained those standards even when it cost us territory and revenue." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that seemed unconscious and vulnerable. "The Torinos operate differently. They think fear and brutality toward anyone connected to their targets is effective business strategy. They proved that when they decided an 80-year-old boy was fair game." Maya could hear the pain beneath his controlled tone, the weight of responsibility for keeping his family safe in a world where other people's children were considered acceptable collateral damage. Despite her moral objections to his lifestyle, she was beginning to understand that the reality was more complex than she'd initially thought. "What happened to Antonio's mother?" she asked softly. Vincenzo's face shuddered completely. "Car accident," he said after a long moment. "But there were questions about whether the brakes had been tampered with. Questions I never got answers to because I was too grief-stricken to push for a proper investigation until it was too late." The admission hung between them, loaded with guilt and regret that Maya recognized from her own experience with sudden loss. She'd spent months wondering if there was something she could have done differently, some way she might have prevented her parents' accident or better prepared for the financial devastation that followed. "I became a different kind of leader after Elena died," Vincenzo continued. "More careful about threats, more protective of the people I care about. Some would say more paranoid." As if summoned by the tension in the room, Antonio appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas and clutching a stuffed elephant that looked well-loved despite his attempts to appear grown-up. He approached Maya's chair without hesitation, climbing into her lap with the unconscious trust that only children possessed. "I had a bad dream," he said simply, settling against her chest, as if her presence was the most natural comfort in the world. Maya's arms came around him instinctively, her heart clenching at how small and warm he felt against her. "What was the dream about?" she asked gently. "The bad men came back," Antonio whispered. "But you weren't there to protect me." Vincenzo was beside them in an instant, his hand stroking his son's curly hair with infinite tenderness. "Maya's here now," he said quietly, "and she's going to stay until you feel safe again." The promise in his voice made Maya look up sharply, meeting eyes that held an intensity she couldn't quite interpret. When he reached out to smooth a strand of hair from her face, his touch was careful and warm, his fingers lingering against her cheek longer than necessary. Time seemed suspended as they looked at each other over Antonio's head, the space between them charged with awareness that had nothing to do with gratitude or obligation. Maya felt her breath catch as Vincenzo leaned slightly closer, his intent clear in the way his gaze dropped to her lips. The security alert that shattered the moment was loud enough to make them all jump. Vincenzo's phone buzzed insistently as Marco's voice came through the intercom system announcing a perimeter breach that turned out to be a false alarm caused by a deer triggering motion sensors. But the interruption had been enough to remind Maya exactly how complicated her situation had become. She was falling for a man whose world included enemies who thought children were acceptable targets, whose protection came at the cost of accepting a lifestyle she'd been raised to consider criminal. As Vincenzo carried his sleepy son upstairs and Maya made her way back to the guest quarters, she couldn't stop thinking about the moment when his hand had touched her face, when she'd wanted nothing more than to close the distance between them despite every rational objection her mind could offer. The thought that she might be starting to care about Vincenzo Romano as more than just her rescuer was as terrifying as any threat the Torino family could pose. The nightmare started 3 days later. Maya would wake gasping, her heart racing as phantom bullets tore through her body and the sound of gunshots echoed in her ears. The rational part of her mind knew she was safe in the luxurious guest suite, but her subconscious hadn't received the message. She was sitting on the edge of her bed at 2 in the morning, trying to calm her breathing and convince herself that the shadows in the corners weren't hiding armed men, when a soft knock came at her door. Maya, Vincenzo's voice carried quiet concern through the wood. "Are you all right?" She wanted to lie, to maintain some dignity and independence, but the words that came out were raw with exhaustion. "No, I'm not." He entered without hesitation, moving through the darkened room with the careful grace she'd come to associate with him. When he reached her bedside, Maya could see worry etched in the lines around his storm-gray eyes. "Another nightmare," she said unnecessarily, aware of how small and broken she must look in the oversized sleep shirt that had been provided along with other necessities. Vincenzo sat carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining enough distance to be respectful while close enough that his presence felt solid and reassuring. "How long have they been happening?" "Every night since the security alert," Maya admitted. "I keep reliving those moments on the sidewalk, but in my dreams, I don't save Antonio in time. Or sometimes the bullets kill me and I watch him get taken while I'm dying." The admission hung between them in the quiet darkness. Maya had never been good at accepting comfort from others, had learned early that vulnerability was often interpreted as weakness. But something about Vincenzo's steady presence made her defenses feel unnecessary. "I have nightmares too," he said quietly. "About Elena, about losing Antonio, about all the ways I might fail to protect the people I care about." Maya turned to study his profile in the dim light filtering through the curtains. He rarely spoke about his late wife, and when he did, it was usually in practical terms related to Antonio's care or household arrangements. This felt different, more personal. "What was she like?" Maya asked. Vincenzo was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Kind," he said finally. "Stronger than me in ways that mattered. She believed there was good in everyone, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Elena thought she could reform me, help me find a way out of this life." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Maya found herself reaching for his hand without thinking, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of comfort that felt as natural as breathing. "What happened to her?" Maya whispered. "She was coming home from a charity board meeting," Vincenzo said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "The roads were icy, and her car went off the bridge into the river. By the time emergency crews reached her, she'd been underwater for 8 minutes. Maya's chest clenched with sympathetic grief. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "The worst part was the questions afterward," Vincenzo continued. "Whether someone had tampered with her brakes, whether the accident was actually retaliation for business decisions I'd made. I spent months investigating, but I never found proof either way." He turned to look at her directly, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I swore after that I would never let my choices put someone I cared about in danger again. Then you saved Antonio, and suddenly I'm responsible for protecting someone else who's become a target because of who I am." Maya could hear the guilt and self-recrimination in his voice, the way he was blaming himself for circumstances that were completely beyond his control. Without thinking, she shifted closer, her free hand coming up to touch his face in a gesture meant to offer comfort. "You didn't put me in danger," she said firmly. "I chose to help Antonio. Everything that happened after was my decision, not something you forced on me." The space between them seemed to shrink as Vincenzo leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as if her words had provided relief he desperately needed. When he looked at her again, the intensity in his gaze made her pulse race. "Maya," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion she couldn't fully interpret. The kiss happened slowly, giving both of them time to recognize what was building between them and choose whether to let it continue. When Vincenzo's lips finally touched hers, it was with a gentleness that spoke of carefully controlled desire and deep respect for her healing. Maya had been kissed before, but never like this. never with the sense that the person holding her understood exactly how fragile trust could be and was determined to handle it with infinite care. When she responded, pressing closer despite the protests from her still-healing injuries, Vincenzo's arms came around her with a protectiveness that made her feel safer than she had in months. They broke apart slowly, both breathing hard in the quiet darkness. Maya could feel her heart racing, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from fear or panic. It was from want, from a growing awareness that what she felt for Vincenzo had moved far beyond gratitude into something that could change everything about her carefully guarded heart. "This complicates things," she whispered against his lips. "Everything about this situation is already complicated," Vincenzo replied, his thumb stroking gently across her cheek. "The question is whether you're willing to let it be complicated together." Before Maya could answer, her exhaustion finally overwhelmed the adrenaline from both the nightmare and their kiss. She found herself leaning against Vincenzo's shoulder, his warmth and solid presence finally allowing her nervous system to believe she was truly safe. "Stay," she murmured as sleep began to claim her. "Please." Vincenzo settled more comfortably against the headboard, his arms adjusting to support her weight without disturbing her injuries. For the first time in days, Maya slept without dreaming. The following morning brought new complications in the form of Vincenzo's family. Maya woke to find herself curled against his side, his hand stroking gently through her hair as he spoke quietly on the phone in what sounded like rapid Italian. "My mother and sister," he explained after ending the call. "They're coming for Sunday dinner. They want to meet the woman who saved Antonio." Maya felt a flutter of anxiety that had nothing to do with physical pain. Meeting his family felt significant in ways that went beyond simple introductions. It suggested a level of integration into his world that she wasn't sure she was ready to navigate. Carmen Romano was exactly what Maya had expected the matriarch of a powerful family to be. Elegant, sharp-eyed, and clearly accustomed to having her opinions valued and her questions answered. Sofia, Vincenzo's younger sister, carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd grown up beautiful and protected, though her warmth toward Antonio was genuine. "So you're the woman who threw herself in front of bullets for our Antonio," Carmen said during dinner, her dark eyes studying Maya with an intensity that felt like an evaluation. "I did what anyone would have done," Maya replied carefully. "No," Carmen corrected firmly. "Most people would have looked away, minded their own business, protected themselves first. What you did was extraordinary." The approval in her voice was unmistakable, but Maya could sense underlying concerns that had nothing to do with her heroism. Throughout dinner, she caught meaningful glances between Vincenzo's mother and sister, conversations conducted entirely through raised eyebrows and subtle head tilts. Later, as they sat in the garden while Antonio showed off his soccer skills, Sofia addressed what everyone had been thinking. "She seems lovely, Vincenzo, but are you sure this is wise?" his sister said quietly. "Getting involved with someone because of the circumstances." "I'm not involved with her because of the circumstances," Vincenzo replied, his tone carrying a warning that made Sofia raise her hands and surrender. Maya pretended to be absorbed in watching Antonio, but every word of their conversation felt like it was being carved into her chest. The doubt in Sofia's voice echoed fears Maya had been trying to ignore. Was what she felt for Vincenzo real, or was it just misplaced gratitude mixed with proximity and vulnerability? Carmen approached her conversation more directly as they walked through the rose garden after dinner. "You care for my son," she said without preamble. It wasn't really a question, but Maya found herself nodding anyway. "I do. And he cares for you," which is obvious to anyone with eyes. Carmen paused beside a particularly beautiful climbing rose, her expression thoughtful. But caring and being right for each other are different things. The older woman's words were gentle but clear. She was concerned about the circumstances that had brought them together, worried that crisis and gratitude might be mistaken for something deeper and more lasting. That evening, after his family had left and Antonio was asleep, Maya found Vincenzo in his study reviewing what looked like security reports. The tension in his shoulders was visible even from across the room. "More threats?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Marco intercepted communications suggesting the Torinos are planning something more direct, Vincenzo said, without looking up. "They're tired of subtle pressure." Maya felt ice settle in her stomach. What does more direct mean? It means they're done trying to negotiate and ready to take what they want by force, Vincenzo replied, finally meeting her eyes. It means the kind of escalation that puts everyone I care about at higher risk. As if summoned by their conversation, Marco appeared in the doorway with the grim expression that meant bad news. We need to increase security protocols, he said without preamble. Intelligence suggests they're planning to move within the week. Maya watched Vincenzo transform before her eyes. The gentle man who'd comforted her through nightmares replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. When he began discussing response strategies with Marco, his voice carried an authority that made it clear why people followed his orders without question. The conversation that followed involved details about weapons, surveillance, and contingency plans that made Maya's head spin. This was the reality of Vincenzo's world, the constant threat assessment and strategic thinking required to keep his family safe. When Marco left to implement new security measures, Maya remained in her chair, processing what she'd just witnessed. Vincenzo seemed to sense her internal struggle because he came around the desk to kneel beside her chair, his hands covering hers. I understand if this is too much, he said quietly. If you want to leave, I'll make sure you're protected until the situation with the Torinos is resolved. Maya looked into his storm-gray eyes, seeing the man who'd held her through nightmares and the leader who could order violent retaliation with equal conviction. The contradiction should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to the uncertain safety of life on the streets. Instead, she found herself thinking about Antonio's absolute trust in his father's protection, about the tenderness Vincenzo showed when he thought no one was watching, about the way he'd never once made her feel like a burden despite how much her presence had complicated his life. I'm not leaving, she said firmly, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Vincenzo's relief was visible, but he continued to search her face as if looking for uncertainty she might be hiding. Maya, what happened between us last night? Before he could finish whatever careful statement he was preparing, Maya leaned forward and kissed him. Unlike the gentle exploration of the previous evening, this kiss carried determination and clear intent. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Maya's decision was written clearly in her eyes. This time when Vincenzo carried her upstairs, it wasn't to comfort her through nightmares. This time, when he laid her gently on his bed and asked if she was certain this was what she wanted, Maya's yes carried no hesitation. Their first time together was careful and patient. Vincenzo's attention focused entirely on her pleasure and comfort. When he touched her, it was with the same protective reverence he'd shown throughout her recovery, as if she was something precious that had been entrusted to his care. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the quiet darkness, Maya finally understood what she'd been fighting since the moment she woke up in his medical facility. She was falling in love with Vincenzo Romano, dangerous world and all. Tomorrow would bring new threats and difficult decisions, but tonight, in the circle of his arms, Maya finally felt like she'd found her way home. Maya woke to the sound of Vincenzo's phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. In the 3 weeks since they'd become lovers, she'd learned to recognize the different tones of his business calls. This one carried the sharp urgency that meant serious trouble. Marco's voice was tense even through the speaker. They took Sofia. Maya felt Vincenzo's entire body go rigid beside her. When he asked, his voice deadly calm in a way that made her pulse race with fear. 2 hours ago, she was leaving her apartment for work. Professional job, no witnesses, her security detail eliminated. Maya watched Vincenzo transform before her eyes. The tender man who'd made love to her the night before replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. He was already reaching for clothes, his movements sharp and efficient as his mind shifted into crisis mode. What do they want? Vincenzo asked, pulling on pants with mechanical precision. Exchange. Sofia for you stepping back from all Little Italy operations. They're calling in 1 hour with specifics. After Vincenzo ended the call, Maya could see the guilt and fury warring in his storm-gray eyes. His sister had been taken because of business decisions he'd made, used as leverage in a conflict that had now escalated beyond any reasonable boundaries. This is my fault, he said quietly, running hands through his hair in a gesture that spoke of barely controlled emotion. I should have ended this before they felt desperate enough to target family. Maya rose from the bed, wrapping a robe around herself as she approached him. They chose to escalate this, not you. They're the ones who decided kidnapping was acceptable business practice. But Vincenzo was already retreating behind the walls he built when protecting others, his expression closing off in preparation for making decisions he didn't want her involved in. You need to pack a bag, he said without looking at her. Marco will take you somewhere safe while we handle this. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. After everything they'd shared, after the way he'd held her through nightmares and made her feel like she was finally part of something, he was still trying to shield her from the realities of his world. No, she said firmly. Vincenzo's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his features. This isn't a discussion, Maya. These people have already shown they're willing to hurt innocents. I won't risk you becoming another casualty. And I won't be shipped off like helpless cargo while you handle this alone, Maya replied, crossing her arms despite how the gesture pulled at her still-healing injuries. I'm not some fragile thing you need to protect from reality. The argument that followed was their first real fight, fueled by fear and frustration on both sides. Vincenzo couldn't understand why she wanted to stay involved when staying safe was an option. Maya couldn't make him see that being protected from his problems made her feel like a temporary guest rather than someone building a life with him. You almost died once because of my world, Vincenzo said, his voice raw with emotion. I won't watch it happen again. And I won't watch you carry this burden alone when I could help, Maya shot back. Your sister is in danger because she's connected to you. I'm connected to you too, which means this affects me whether you want it to or not. The standoff lasted until Antonio appeared in the doorway, his small face showing confusion at the raised voices. Something's wrong with Aunt Sophia, isn't it? He said with the perceptive clarity that children often possessed. Vincenzo knelt to his son's level, his expression softening despite the crisis. Some bad people are trying to cause trouble, but we're going to fix it. Maya watched the interaction and understood something fundamental about the man she'd fallen in love with. He would sacrifice anything, including his own happiness, to keep his family safe. The realization made her argument shift from demands to partnership. Let me help you bring her home, she said quietly after Antonio had been distracted with breakfast. You know I'm not going to be able to just sit somewhere safe wondering if you're alive or dead. Vincenzo studied her face for a long moment, and Maya could see the internal struggle between his protective instincts and his growing understanding that she wasn't going to be content remaining on the sidelines indefinitely. The planning session that followed in Vincenzo's study included more people than Maya had expected. Marco led the tactical discussion, but there were others whose presence suggested the full resources of Vincenzo's organization were being mobilized. Maya listened to discussions of surveillance, weapons, and strategic positioning with growing appreciation for the complexity of what they were attempting. When the Torinos called with their demands, Maya watched Vincenzo negotiate with a cold precision that reminded her exactly why people followed his leadership. He agreed to meet them in person to discuss terms, a decision that made everyone in the room except Maya visibly uncomfortable. It's obviously a trap, Marco said bluntly. They have no intention of letting Sophia go regardless of what you agree to. I know, Vincenzo replied calmly. But it gets me close enough to end this permanently. The plan that emerged was dangerous and complicated, requiring split-second timing and coordination between multiple teams. Maya found herself assigned to communications, monitoring radio traffic and providing real-time intelligence to the field teams. As evening approached and final preparations were made, Vincenzo found Maya in the guest quarters where she was checking equipment one last time. The tension in his shoulders was visible, but when he looked at her, his storm-gray eyes held something that made her breath catch. I need you to know something before we do this, he said quietly, settling beside her on the bed. If something goes wrong tonight, if this doesn't end the way we're planning. Maya pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping the words she could see were difficult for him to voice. Nothing's going wrong, she said firmly. We're going to get Sophia back and end this threat to your family. Vincenzo caught her hand, pressing it against his chest, where she could feel his heart racing beneath her palm. I love you, he said simply. Not because you saved Antonio, not because of the circumstances that brought us together, but because of who you are. Because you're brave enough to argue with me when I'm being overprotective and stubborn enough to insist on being part of solutions instead of hiding from problems. The words hit Maya with more force than she'd expected. She'd known what she felt for him had moved beyond gratitude and attraction, but hearing him voice similar feelings made everything feel more real and more terrifying. "I love you too," she said, surprised by how easily the admission came. "I love your dedication to your family and your willingness to do whatever it takes to protect them. I love that you're gentle with Antonio's fears and patient with my nightmares. I love that you see me as someone strong enough to stand beside you rather than someone who needs to be kept safely away from anything difficult." The kiss that followed was desperate and claiming, both of them pouring emotion they couldn't fully express into the connection between them. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincenzo rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I want to talk about our future, about what it would look like for you to stay permanently, to be part of this family officially." Before Maya could process the implications of that statement, Marco's voice came through the comm system announcing final preparations were complete. As they made their way to the command center Vincenzo had established in his study, Maya felt a strange sense of clarity about what was happening. For months, she'd been surviving without purpose, existing day to day, without anything meaningful to fight for. Tonight, she was part of something that mattered, using skills she'd developed during her accounting career to support a mission that would protect people she'd come to love. The operation unfolded with precision that spoke to Vincenzo's strategic thinking and his team's professionalism. Maya tracked multiple moving pieces from the communications hub, coordinating between surveillance teams and the response units positioned around the warehouse where the exchange was supposed to take place. When the Torinos revealed their true intentions by opening fire instead of negotiating, Maya's training kicked in automatically. She coordinated backup teams, tracked enemy positions through security cameras, and provided the real-time intelligence that allowed Vincenzo's people to respond effectively to changing tactical situations. The confrontation was over in less than 20 minutes. Sofia was recovered safely. The immediate threat to Vincenzo's family was eliminated, and the surviving members of the Torino operation were in no condition to continue their territorial ambitions. Maya was still processing the adrenaline rush when Vincenzo returned to the estate, his sister safe but shaken. Watching them embrace, seeing the relief and gratitude in his eyes, Maya understood that she'd been part of something that mattered in ways that went beyond her own survival or happiness. Later, after Sofia had been checked by medical staff and the immediate crisis had been fully resolved, Maya found herself alone with Vincenzo on the terrace where they'd shared so many quiet conversations during her recovery. "You were incredible tonight," he said, pulling her against his side as they looked out over the grounds that had become her home. "We were incredible," Maya corrected. "All of us working together." Vincenzo turned to face her fully, his expression serious in a way that made her pulse quicken. "I meant what I said earlier about talking about our future." Before she could respond, he was kneeling beside her chair, a ring box appearing in his hands with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been planning this moment for longer than the crisis had lasted. "Maya-chan," he said quietly, his storm gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "You saved my son's life and changed everything about my world in the process. Will you marry me? Will you be part of this family officially and permanently?" Maya looked down at the man who'd rescued her from more than just physical danger, who'd helped her remember what it felt like to matter to someone and be part of something larger than her own survival. The answer came without hesitation. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear in the quiet evening air. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Vincenzo slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, Maya realized that the moment she'd thrown herself between gunmen and a frightened child had led her not just to survival, but to a life she'd never imagined possible. She'd found love, purpose, and a family that would protect her as fiercely as she'd protected them. The homeless woman who'd had nothing left to lose had become someone with everything to fight for. The wedding planning revealed sides of both their personalities that Maya hadn't expected. Vincenzo, who commanded a complex organization with ruthless efficiency, became surprisingly invested in details like flower arrangements and seating charts. Maya, who'd been focused on basic survival for months, found herself overwhelmed by choices about everything from dress styles to menu options. "We could elope," she suggested during one particularly stressful morning when they'd been debating invitation lists for 2 hours. "Just us, Antonio, and whoever you need to make it legal." Vincenzo looked up from the guest list he'd been reviewing, his storm gray eyes reflecting amusement at her exasperation. "My mother would never forgive either of us," he said with a smile. "Besides, Antonio has very specific ideas about what our wedding should include." As if summoned by their conversation, the 80-year-old appeared in the doorway with a notebook covered in his careful handwriting. "I made a list of everything we need," he announced with the seriousness of someone planning a major diplomatic summit. Maya listened as Antonio outlined his vision for their ceremony, which included elements both traditional and uniquely his own. He wanted to walk Maya down the aisle since she didn't have a father to do it. He wanted to give a speech about how she'd saved him and changed their family. He wanted the reception to include dancing because he'd been practicing and wanted to show everyone his moves. The love and acceptance in his young voice made Maya's throat tight with emotion. In all her imaginings of what marriage might look like someday, she'd never pictured becoming a stepmother, but Antonio had claimed her as family from their first meeting. The thought that she could give him the stable maternal presence he'd been missing felt like a gift she'd never expected to receive. The ceremony itself took place 6 weeks later in the garden where Maya had first begun to understand the complexity of Vincenzo's world. Carmen had transformed the space with flowers and lighting that created an atmosphere both elegant and intimate, while maintaining the family feeling that made the estate feel like home. Maya wore a dress that struck the perfect balance between simplicity and sophistication, chosen with input from Sophia, who'd insisted on being involved in every detail of the planning despite her recent ordeal. Walking down the petal-strewn path with Antonio beside her, his small hand steady in hers, Maya felt like she was stepping into a life she'd never dared to imagine. Vincenzo waited at the altar with an expression that made her breath catch. He'd told her he loved her during their engagement, but seeing the way he looked at her as she approached, as if she was the answer to prayers he'd never thought to voice, made the reality of their commitment feel overwhelming in the best possible way. The ceremony was traditional in structure, but personal in execution. They'd written their own vows, and when Vincenzo spoke about how her courage had saved not just his son, but his ability to believe and love again, Maya had to fight back tears. When she promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges their life together might bring, her voice carried the conviction of someone who'd already proven those words through action. But it was Antonio's speech during the reception that brought everyone to tears. Standing on a chair so he could reach the microphone, he spoke with the clarity and sincerity that only children could manage. "Before Maya came to our family, it was just me and Papa, and sometimes that felt lonely even though Papa takes really good care of me. But Maya didn't just save me from the bad men that day. She saved all of us from being lonely." He paused, looking directly at Maya with dark eyes that were so much like his father's. "Now I have a mama again, and Papa smiles all the time, and our house feels full of love instead of just full of empty rooms. Maya taught me that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared." The applause that followed was enthusiastic, but Maya was focused on the way Vincenzo reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers as their son stepped down from his improvised podium with the satisfied air of someone who'd accomplished an important mission. The reception continued late into the evening, filled with dancing, laughter, and the kind of celebration that created memories to carry through less joyful times. Maya found herself surrounded by people who'd started as Vincenzo's family and friends, but who now embraced her as their own. As they swayed together during their first dance as husband and wife, Maya marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been sleeping in doorways and wondering how much longer she could survive on the streets. Tonight, she was dancing in a garden that had become home, surrounded by people who loved her, married to a man who saw her strength rather than just her vulnerability. During their honeymoon in Sicily, Vincenzo showed her the village where his grandparents had been born, the small church where his parents had been married, the traditions that had shaped his understanding of family and loyalty. Maya shared stories about her own family, the values her parents had instilled in her, the dreams she'd carried before tragedy derailed her life. They talked about the foundation Maya wanted to establish in her parents' memory, an organization focused on providing comprehensive support for people experiencing homelessness. Vincenzo not only endorsed the idea, but offered the resources and connections to make it significantly more effective than anything she could have accomplished alone. More importantly, they talked about their future together, the life they wanted to build, the ways they could use their combined strengths to create something meaningful beyond their own happiness. 6 months after their wedding, Maya stood in the offices of the Chun Family Foundation, reviewing quarterly reports that showed their impact growing beyond anything she'd originally envisioned. The organization provided not just emergency shelter and meals, but job training, mental health support, and the kind of comprehensive assistance that helped people rebuild their lives rather than just survive day to day. The work filled a space in Maya's heart that she hadn't realized was empty. Using her accounting background and organizational skills to help others facing the same desperation she'd experienced felt like transforming her worst memories into something that could prevent others from suffering similarly. Vincenzo had been supportive of her passion for the foundation in ways that went beyond financial backing. He'd connected her with political contacts who could influence policy, business leaders who could provide employment opportunities, and other philanthropists who shared their commitment to addressing systemic issues rather than just treating symptoms. Maya was reviewing applications for their new transitional housing program when Carmen knocked on her office door, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the expression that meant she wanted to have one of their increasingly frequent heart-to-heart conversations. "You're glowing," Carmen said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Maya's desk. Maya laughed, recognizing the fishing expedition for what it was. Vincenzo's mother had been dropping increasingly obvious hints about grandchildren for weeks, clearly hoping for news she could celebrate. "I'm happy," Maya replied honestly. "The foundation is exceeding all our goals. Antonio is thriving in school. Vincenzo and I are building something wonderful together." And Carmen prompted with the persistence that had made her formidable in both business and family negotiations. Maya set down her pen and smiled at the woman who'd become more than a mother-in-law, someone whose approval and friendship meant everything to her sense of belonging in this family. "And I'm pregnant." The shriek of joy that followed brought Vincenzo running from his office down the hall, ready to respond to whatever crisis required his immediate attention. Finding his mother crying happy tears while hugging his wife took him several moments to process. When Maya confirmed the news to him directly, Vincenzo's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Wonder, joy, and the kind of protective tenderness that made her understand exactly what kind of father he would be to their child. That evening, they told Antonio together, watching his face transform with excitement as he processed the news that he was going to be a big brother. His immediate response was characteristic of his generous heart. "I'm going to teach the baby everything about being brave and protecting people," he announced with absolute seriousness. "Just like Maya taught me." Later, as they sat together on the terrace where they'd shared so many important conversations, Maya reflected on the transformation her life had undergone. The woman who'd thrown herself between gunmen and a frightened child had found not just survival, but purpose, love, and a future she'd never dared to imagine. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd walked past that restaurant 5 minutes earlier or later? Vincenzo asked, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Maya considered the question, thinking about all the small decisions and random circumstances that had led to that life-changing moment. "I think about it sometimes, but I don't regret it. That moment of courage led me to everything that matters now." She paused, looking out over the grounds where their child would someday play, where they would build memories and traditions that honored both their past and their hopes for the future. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust that the universe knows what it's doing, even when we can't see the bigger picture. 3 months later, Maya was reading bedtime stories to Antonio when he asked the question that had clearly been building in his mind for weeks. "When the baby comes, will you still be my mom too?" he asked with the vulnerability that reminded her he was still a little boy despite his mature insights. Maya set the book aside and pulled him closer, her heart clenching with love for this child who'd become as precious to her as if she'd given birth to him herself. "I will always be your mama," she said firmly. "Being pregnant doesn't change that. If anything, It means our family is growing stronger. Antonio smiled with relief and settled against her side, his small hand resting on her growing belly. Tell me again about the day you and Papa met, he requested. Maya began the story he never tired of hearing, about the rainy evening when an act of instinctive courage had changed all their lives. As she spoke, she found herself thinking about how many people watching this video might be facing their own moments of choice, their own opportunities to step forward when stepping back would be easier and safer. Have you ever had a moment when you had to choose between your own safety and helping someone else? She wondered aloud, addressing not just Antonio, but anyone who might be listening. Those moments reveal who we really are, don't they? They show us what we're capable of when everything else is stripped away. The story continued as it always did, with Antonio falling asleep against her shoulder while she rubbed gentle circles on her belly and planned the future they were building together. When Vincenzo found them an hour later, he carefully lifted his sleeping son to carry him to his own room, then returned to help Maya to their bedroom. I love our life, Maya told him as they settled together in the quiet darkness. I love our life too, Vincenzo replied, his arms coming around her with the same protective tenderness he'd shown since their first meeting. But mostly I love that we're building it together. As Maya drifted toward sleep in the arms of the man who'd saved her in every way that mattered, she thought about the photograph that would be taken the following weekend. A family portrait showing Vincenzo, Maya, and Antonio posed in their garden, her pregnancy just visible beneath the flowing dress Sophia had helped her choose. The image would capture a moment of complete happiness. Three people who'd found their way to each other through tragedy and courage, now building a future that honored both their past and their dreams. It would show what was possible when someone chose bravery over safety, when love was stronger than fear, when families could be created through choice rather than just circumstance. But more than anything, the portrait would show the lasting impact of one woman's split-second decision to protect a stranger's child, a choice that had rippled outward to create new possibilities for everyone involved. Maya fell asleep thinking about the baby growing inside her, the child who would be born into a family built on courage and love, who would grow up knowing that heroes weren't mythical figures, but ordinary people who chose to act when action was needed. The homeless woman who'd once had nothing to lose had become someone with everything to protect and everything to hope for. In saving Antonio, she'd saved herself and found the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. Some stories ended with happily ever after. This one was just beginning.